Otazoi. Okay, we are live. Um, Family and friends, passersby, Facebook strangers, and ghosts and ghouls and trolls. It's a privilege and pleasure, really, to be here today with um, Professor Susannah Heschel for today's episode of A Rabbi and a Professor Walk into a Zoom. I have to admit, I'm a bit like, starstruck almost um, uh, because your work and your family's Yerusha and legacy uh, has been just it's hard to sort of capture what an inspiration it is for me and my own rabbinate. But so thank you for being here today and taking the time out of COVID life to schmooze with us.
My pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
Um, so let's start because I don't have nowhere. Let's start in the beginning. Could you tell us a little bit about where you grew up and the type of what your home looked like?
Where I grew up is the Upper West Side of New York City.
I've heard of it.
And we first lived on 106th Street, and then when I was about 5, we moved to 115th Street in Riverside, and that was about a 10-minute walk from the Jewish Theological Seminary, where my father was a professor and where we went to daven most of the time. And I went to Ramaz in elementary school, and I went to Dalton for high school. And my growing up years, my parents actually were studying all the time. My father was reading books and writing, and my mother was at the piano, playing the piano. I'm an only child. Mm-hmm. And they rarely entertained. They didn't watch television. I think twice they went to a movie. My mother went to a lot of concerts. My father sometimes went with her. But most of the time, if they would go, for example, occasionally to the theater, they would come back and say it was a waste of time. Better spend the time studying. Wow. My father felt. And he was always with a book. Always. There was no such thing as relaxation, no such thing as vacation. We didn't have that. I grew up with it. It was not a concept. My parents sometimes had guests for Shabbat dinner. More often, they had guests for Shabbat afternoon tea at 4 o'clock. And sometimes my father would invite students from his classes. It would come to the table. We had a long time. I'm actually sitting at that dining room table right now.
Wow.
And sometimes they would have friends, colleagues who would come over. Frequently, Elie Wiesel, before he got married, when I was very young, he would come over on Shabbat afternoon. My father, after davening, we'd come home and have lunch. And then my parents would take a nap. And I had to be quiet, which was very difficult. And then after the nap, Elie Wiesel would come over, and my father and Elie would go for a long walk on Riverside Park. And when I say long, I mean in terms of time, maybe an hour. They would walk a few steps, stop, talk, walk another few steps, stop and talk. And that was the walk. And then they would come home for tea at 4 o'clock. And yes, and there were students and faculty, and they would sit and talk, and then daven and make Havdalah.
At what point in your childhood or upbringing did you realize that your father held such a prominent role in the larger Jewish world? Because what you're describing sounds like a very almost idyllic childhood of
Well, actually, when I was little, I was a little confused. I didn't quite know what my father did. And when elementary school, children are always saying, my father's this or that. And I wasn't sure. I know that he was teaching and he was writing books and he was giving lectures, and I didn't quite know how to put it all together. And there needed to be, it seemed, one thing. I know what the one thing was, but when I was very little, I used to say, Moshe wrote the Torah and Tata writes books. And sometimes I would go to someone's home and I would see a copy of my father's book on the shelf, one of my father's books. And I would look at it and I was bewildered. How did they get the book? It was in our house. How did that happen? And I was very confused. My parents thought it was hilarious. Yes, that morphed into another story about my father. But anyway, so yes, my father was busy and doing things, but it was still not quite. And then later on, yes, when he became active, for example, in the civil rights movement, and he was in the newspaper, I started to realize not so much that he was important, but that he was doing the most important thing a person should be doing at this moment. He was joining people in something very important. Mm. And that's what he gave me to feel. Mm.
How, I'm curious because I don't know much about your mother and her work. You mentioned a little bit about her. She was a pianist, or how did she pass her time at home or wherever it was that she spent her days?
So my father gave my mother a Steinway baby grand piano as an engagement gift instead of a diamond ring. That's what she wanted. And wow. So she was at home in the mornings practicing the piano for hours and hours. That's what she wanted to do. Occasionally, maybe once every 2 weeks in the evening, we would have chamber music at home, a violinist, usually piano trios, piano quartets. And then she had a brother in Los Angeles who was a doctor and played the violin. They would play together. So there were friends and family who would come and play music. But my mother never joined any organizations. She was not involved in Hadassah or Women's League or anything like that. She was playing the piano, and then of course she was making dinner and doing those things.
And so after Dalton, where did life take you?
So my parents, of course, wanted me to stay home to go to college, and my relatives, especially my Hasidic relatives, told my parents, well, look, or my cousin Heschel, it was wonderful, said to my parents, when I was growing up in Vienna, my parents brought tutors to the home. This is, of course, before the war. And so she said, you should, if she wants to study, bring tutors to the home. But anyway, yes, so that was, I remember also I was told often, never let a boy know something that you know something he doesn't know. Always make him feel that he knows more. That was very important. And so one of the relatives said to my parents, if you let her go to college, how will she find someone to marry? Things like that. So, I mean, this was the atmosphere. I sometimes joke that I was raised in the Middle Ages. But yes, I went finally, I did not want to stay at home and go to college. I did not want to go to Barnard or NYU. I wanted to go away, but I didn't want to go too far away. My father had a friend who was a professor at Trinity College in Hartford, Connecticut. And I guess my father approached him about taking care of me and so forth. And I was allowed to go there. It was 2 hours away. And I went there. I did look at Brandeis, by the way. But
yeah. You had grown up in a Brandeis on the Upper West Side.
Well, I wanted a little privacy.
Sure.
Actually. And I didn't want to be observed and have everybody writing home to the rabbi saying, oh, Susannah Heschel, she did blah, blah, blah.
Could you talk a little bit about, you mentioned it in passing with your Hasidic relatives, but, here you were going to shul at the seminary, going to school, or at least elementary school at Ramaz, and all of these dissonant Jewish svivas and communities and space. What was that like as a child or as a young adult? How did you make sense of that? Those worlds?
Well, it's very interesting because you use the word dissonant, and I think that actually, for me, it wasn't dissonant. That is, I think my father wanted me to feel at home in every Jewish atmosphere, and I want that for my children too. I want them to experience the range of Jewish life because I feel that everybody makes a contribution. My father used to get a newspaper from a little shop on Broadway at 107th Street that was owned by an elderly man from Russia who was an anarchist. Must have been in his 80s, it seemed. And, my father enjoyed listening to him, talking with him. Because, that also, the Jewish anarchists, and what did they want? They wanted health care for everybody and
that's right.
Childcare and education and okay. That was called an anarchist in those days. There was Paul Avrich made a marvelous film about Jewish anarchists in their summer bungalows in the Catskills in their 80s and 90s. And it was wonderful. Anyway, so yes, we went to the seminary. Men and women sat separately. My father didn't like the davening there. I mean, really, it was very cold. And so he would go to daven at the Gerish Stiebel on the Upper West Side. And sometimes I would go with him, but the women went upstairs to another room and had to listen through the dumbwaiter. It was not so great. Although when I was very little, I could go with him and sit with him. I remember Simchas Torah when I was very little in the men's section. Anyway, when I was in high school, I actually had a friend who lived near Park Avenue Synagogue. And I would every now and then spend Shabbos with her, and I would go and daven there. And I had never experienced conservative Judaism. Men and women sit together, and they had a cantor and an organ and things that were, and that was Jewish too.
Right.
But I think it's good for us as Jews to know all the different manifestations.
Absolutely. I mean, I'm curious about that myself because I grew up speaking Yiddish with my father, but not because he grew up in a Hasidic or religious home at all. It was from a different secular and cultural community. So I'm curious how the and I appreciate your framing of it not being dissonant, but this is what you do. This is what our pluralistic people look like in different shades. I'm curious though, like, as a child, did you see a disconnect, or did you see those contradictions, and how did those get framed then to you by your parents?
Yes, well, I suppose that the problem for me was why, as a little girl, I couldn't do what the little boys were doing in the synagogue. So the little boys would march behind the Torah, and I had to go and sit down. And we were little, 7, 8 years old. And excuse me, and the little boys were preparing for the bar mitzvah. And at Ramaz, as they were preparing in class for the bar mitzvah, the girls went into the library to take sewing lessons.
Wow.
I knew even then that this was not right. And I wanted a bat mitzvah. So that was the dissonance. My father, of course, my father came from a Hasidic family, and some of his relatives who were Hasidic Rebbes had come over to the United States, to New York, before the war. So I actually have really the great privilege of having met some of those Rebbes, the Boyaner, my uncle the Kapitchnitzer, the Old Novominsker, and so many. That is very, very special. That was an extraordinary generation. So was there dissonance there? I felt there was something very special. I felt that I understood what holiness was from them. And when I started to study religion and read books like Rudolf Otto on, the idea of the holy and so on, that somehow the scholars of religion didn't understand holiness, that they had never experienced what I experienced. Maybe that sounds odd to say, but that was something very special. And I actually think my father captures it in language. He captures that experience, which is so hard to put into words, but he's able to do that.
Yes, and not in his first or second or third language either.
His fourth.
And so when you were at college, what piqued your interest? What were you studying at the time?
I was studying Hebrew Bible, and in my first year of college, I remember it quite vividly. Well, first of all, let me just say that my father had a heart attack just before I went to college. I got there 2 weeks late. I missed the orientation and so forth, and I was very worried about him and very anxious. But I signed up, really, it was the last minute, for a small seminar in Hebrew Bible exegesis with the professor John Gettier. And I loved that class. And I remember I had a bicycle from high school. I remember riding my bicycle across the campus to go to class, to his class, feeling euphoric. Thinking to myself, this is euphoria. This is, and I just loved it. And so what I didn't love was the field of biblical scholarship. The field itself was asking, I thought, questions that weren't very interesting. I've noticed it recently. It's just striking to me that people are writing more and more about the prophets, the Hebrew prophets. David Blight, in his biography on Frederick Douglass that won the Pulitzer Prize, starts out by framing him as a prophet, an American prophet, where Kathleen Caveney, who teaches law at Boston College and theology, something similar about the prophets and the kind of moral condemnation that the prophets bring that is not destructive. It doesn't call for the destruction. They don't call for destruction of society. They're trying to lift people out. She calls it, I think she calls it a kind of moral chemotherapy. And I like that phrase. And yeah. So I think there is an interest in the Hebrew prophets in America that, of course, my father did not find in Germany. It's unique in America, but it's very important. And I think sometimes Bible scholars worry too much about technicalities of the text and not enough. They lose the forest for the trees.
Was that something that you felt like instinctually aware of when you were biking to class and growing up with the framing of in your father's home versus in the academic setting, or was that something you came to discover over time?
Well, I think that I love the way my father spoke about the Bible, first of all. And then I also was inspired by Martin Luther King and by my father's friends who were involved in the anti-Vietnam War movement and how they were inspired by the Bible. So it just felt to me that the Bible was the most important book in the world in every way, religiously, politically, in terms of civil culture. So I fell in love with the Bible.
Your father famously talks about the writes about the notion of what it is to be a religious person and being indifferent to other people's suffering. And of course, as a Holocaust refugee himself, he was so familiar with that, with just the indescribable loss that the Jewish people faced in that period of history. But I'm curious, as a young adult, I can't imagine there were many. Now we sort of take that voice for granted, that sort of prophetic religious voice for granted. But at the time, I can't imagine that it was sort of the common denominator. Is that accurate?
Yes. Rabbis in Europe, for instance, were called Seelsorger, somebody who cares for you, the state of your soul. They didn't take political positions. And I'm struck also when rabbis came to the United States starting in the second half of the 19th century, or cantors, teachers, it was a small Jewish community at that point before the Russian Jews arrived, but they didn't notice the slavery around them, except with certain exceptions, David Einhorn, for example. But there was a general notion that Europe was a place of anti-Semitism, and coming to America, we're coming to freedom. And in many ways, of course, America was and is still to this day a place of enormous freedom and democracy compared to many other countries. But it's also a place where in the 19th century, we still had slavery. And after that, we had Jim Crow. Now we have the new Jim Crow. We have profound racism, as we are aware. And a question would be, what does it take to be aware, to take the blinders off our eyes and see what's going on around us? And do we really have the right to say, I'm free, this is the land of the free, when not everyone, my neighbors, are not free? Should we be saying that? I don't. Should we be a little more measured and cautious in how we think about ourselves as Jews and about others? I don't think it's possible for me as a Jew to feel 100% safe in a country where not everyone is safe. I don't think anybody should feel 100% safe when there are white nationalists running around, for example. And that's why my father also felt it's very important for us to be good allies and to have allies. That's what we wanted in the 1930s against Hitler. We wanted allies who, although they were not Jewish, they would speak out against him on our behalf. And that was the tragedy, that we didn't have allies.
There's so many different directions we could go, but you bring up this notion of allyship, especially in the framing of the Jewish people's struggle in Eastern Europe. And I guess I'm today, when you look at the makeup of the Jewish world, the political and the political world, do you see us upholding that, upholding your father's charge of allyship in greater ways? Do we how are we doing on that task?
Some of us, yes, some of us are. I think Jews who, for example, already in the 60s, the young Jews who were going down as freedom riders, some gave their lives to be good allies of African Americans in the struggle for freedom in the 60s already. And today, yes, the same is true today. And there are Jews who want to be allies also in Israel. That is, religious and secular Jews should also learn to be allies in Israel. Right wing and left wing need to come together. And when we search for peace, it was Amos Oz who said, we don't make peace with our friends, we make peace with our enemies. So I don't know if we first make peace and then become allies, or first become allies and then make peace. I don't know how I feel, but there are people in peace studies, and I think we need more of that. How does one make peace? How should we? It's not just a matter of political treaties. It's a matter of a culture. I don't know, but I think what we need and what we want, and certainly what the prophets tell us, is that we want peace. And anybody who says that Israel doesn't want peace is wrong.
And so this was a little bit of your, this is your milieu, your childhood milieu and your upbringing, and you come onto the American college campus. You're studying Hebrew Bible. Where does life take you next?
So thinking that I would go into the field of Hebrew Bible, I went to Harvard Divinity School and I did a master's degree there, and decided that I was really more interested in the pathology of the field of biblical scholarship, which is a field that interested me in particular in the 19th century, that involved Jews as well as Protestants. Then I went to Hebrew University to study, and then I came to the University of Pennsylvania and did a PhD. And while I was there, Schocken Books offered me a contract to edit a book, which I did, called On Being a Jewish Feminist. So that was always a point of interest for me. And I learned from feminist theory how better and more deeply to understand the problems facing the 19th century German Jews I was writing about, especially Jews who were studying the Hebrew Bible, because there was really a contest between Protestants who controlled the universities and controlled the academic journals of publication, and really controlled the field, and then Jews who had something very important to say and who were trying to change that. And so feminist theory also brought me to post-colonial theory, and the idea that actually the situation in Germany, with all of these special laws regulating Jews, leading to emancipation way in the future, really after the First World War, full emancipation, but gradually here and there and so forth. But this kind of regulation was exactly what colonial powers do. They regulate the lives. There's a wonderful book about it in Egypt by Samir Esmir called juridical humanity, but how you become human through the laws. So anyway, Jewish lives are being regulated. I started thinking about Jews as being Germany's colonized people within Germany. So an internal colonization. And then the question became, well, if you're colonized and you don't like it, what do you do? And I saw that, I argued that on the theological level, on the intellectual level, and the level of scholarship, Jews were actually engaged in a revolt against being colonized. And they were trying to change that. And they actually, instead of just being the objects of scrutiny, with Christians putting Judaism under the microscope and saying, oh, this is legalism or this is whatever, instead they turned the tables and they reversed the gaze, is how I called it. And they, as Jewish scholars, started looking at Christianity and saying, wait a minute, you think Jesus is new? No, everything Jesus taught, that's what Jews were saying in the first century. And Christians were reading this material. I also went through these journals, every journal for a couple of decades to see how they were reading Jewish scholarship, Jewish theology. They were reading this material and responding to it. Sometimes with a lot of hostility, sometimes actually feeling very challenged. If all of these teachings of Jesus were said by other Jews, then what's original here? What's new? And they wanted to preserve something original. And the way they did it was either to negate Judaism in some way and say, well, the Jews were blind. They didn't understand you, that kind of old argument. Or some of them turned to racial theory and said, well, maybe what Jesus said was Jewish, but racially he wasn't Jewish. Racially, he was an Aryan. And that began already in the late 19th century and continued, of course, through the Nazi period and became a form of propaganda, anti-Semitic propaganda in support of the Nazis. It was a way of saying, well, Christianity is not a Jewish religion, which is what some Nazis were saying. No, it's an anti-Jewish religion. And there were even some who said that the Hebrew prophets are anti-Semitic because they're always attacking Israel for its sins. So I traced that trajectory. Yeah, I don't know what to say. It's still, for some reason, controversial in Germany to say that some of these guys were anti-Semitic. I don't understand it.
It's also, there's a parallel there when I think about your own father's work in terms of Christian-Jewish dialogue and Catholic-Jewish dialogue and relationships or sort of study. Do you as you have entered into your own career and dove into your own scholarship, where is his voice in your work? I see a plethora of books on your walls, and I'm curious, what it is to sort of carry that his sort of scholarship along with your own that you're forging.
Wow. And I'll tell you, a lot of these books behind me now, these are from my father, and I have thousands more of his library. I'll tell you, my father never talked about anti-Semitism. He always looked for common ground. So in some sense, my work on Germany, and especially in Nazi Germany, is not the sort of thing he would have done. And I would imagine he would have said to me, don't do that. I think what motivated me is what motivated a lot of Jews in that period of time, which is in the 70s, 80s, 90s, which was really a lot of anger about the Shoah and what it had done to our families. And I needed, for my own personal reasons, I don't know, psychological reasons, I needed to somehow write about Nazis. One thing, I had to look at these Nazi documents and confront them and be angry and express my anger in this book. And somebody once wrote that the book seemed dry, and someone else wrote it was too emotional. And I don't know, but I guess I personally needed to do it. My father didn't. He didn't write out of anger. And I find that amazing. He didn't write out of anger, and he didn't write about anti-Semitism. He wrote about Christians and Jews without talking about anti-Semitism. And I think that's extraordinary. I think in part, I would say maybe it is my father's prophetic tradition to condemn evil when you see it. And I needed to condemn those German theologians for what they said about my Judaism. And the first time I read a book by Rudolf Bultmann that had a chapter about Judaism, I thought I was reading Mein Kampf. I mean, I really reacted strongly. So, but beyond,
can you talk a little bit about what it's been like to teach Jewish studies at an American university? And you talked a little bit about the sort of the soul, the piece that you found missing in when you were a student. I'm curious how you navigate that terrain today.
Yes. So I started, my first teaching position was at SMU, Southern Methodist University in Dallas, where I had some marvelous students. I love them. And there's a small group of them, but 10 of them, and they kept wanting to take classes with me. So I had to keep coming up with new courses to teach. I was there for 3 years. Dallas was difficult for me. And I went to Israel every summer for 2 months to recuperate, and then I went to Cleveland, which was the most fantastic. It is the most fantastic city and the most fantastic Jewish community on earth. I think. I mean, okay, I'm exaggerating. There's Jerusalem too, but okay. But Cleveland was fantastic. I loved being at Case Western Reserve University, and I enjoyed developing a center for Jewish studies, the Samuel Rosenthal Center. We brought in a lot of speakers, and a lot of people from the Jewish community came. And I felt it was very important for me that universities and communities come together in all fields, not just Jewish studies, but that we do outreach, that we bring the community in to hear what we're writing about. And we also try to make sure that when we write articles and books, that we transmit those ideas to people. They may not have time to read what we're writing, so let's talk about it. Let's explain it. We need to have a bridge and not be over there in an ivory tower. And of course, that's exactly what my father did. He gave lectures at synagogues and Jewish community centers and so forth. At Dartmouth is in a very small town, a little village, Hanover, New Hampshire. And it has now more and more Jewish students. I'm in a religion department and a Jewish studies program. So for some reason, Jewish studies at Dartmouth is booming. We are very popular. And right now, of course, the situation has changed with the terrible COVID-19 virus. But until a year or two ago, we estimated around half the undergraduates took a Jewish studies course. Our numbers were that high in enrollment. And our classes are exciting and wonderful. More recently, I can tell you, for example, that my sort of bread and butter course on modern Jewish history and culture I've changed it. When I was in graduate school, nobody talked about Jews in Iran or Iraq or North Africa, Ottoman Empire. It was always Europe and Russia, America.
Right.
So I've been working hard to bring in that material as well and integrate it. I'm now also trying to emphasize. We have a wonderful new I don't know if it's this consortium, it's called, at Dartmouth, on race, migration, and sexuality that involves a lot of faculty. And that's made me think about the centrality of migration in modern Jewish history, to talk about what that means. How does migration affect religious identity, language? There's so many aspects of Jewish expression. So I'm highlighting migration. The other thing is racism, how anti-Semitism affects Jewish life. And also racism within the Jewish world. And sometimes it can be, for instance, a kind of denigration of Jews in North Africa by the Jews in Europe, a sense that they're primitive.
Right.
Not that they have something to offer us, it's very important. Those kinds of attitudes, the Alliance that sent schools to the Ottoman Empire, North Africa, even to the Balkans, to Jewish communities. Yeah, it's great, but it also comes with certain attitudes that are denigrating. In Israel, we've had conflicts, as we well know. It's unbelievable to me. I mean, to me, a Jew is a Jew. Doesn't matter what your eye color, your skin color, all of this is ridiculous. A Jew is a Jew. But the idea that there would be discrimination because some Jews have a darker skin, this is, yeah, but we need to talk about that also. So, and gender obviously is an important issue. There is no such thing as the Jew. The Jewish experience is different. Jewish men could go to universities early in the 19th century. Jewish women couldn't go until women were emancipated. The end of the century. So race, migration, sexuality, or gender, those are major themes now for my course. As I try to make Jewish studies also part of the larger collection of issues that the whole university is thinking about in all of the different departments. These are things that are on our mind right now.
You're also teaching and writing about a way of life that is deeply yours, you know, that you're living out in your own day-to-day life of raising a family and practicing as a Jew. And I'm curious what it's like to live in that intersection between scholarship and practice and identity. What does that feel like?
Wow. So the most important thing to me, in my family, is Shabbat, and making Shabbat wonderful for my family, and for all of us, making it wonderful for one another. It's very difficult now that the synagogues are closed because of the virus. Yes, I think is always a problem of how do you convey to your kids and your partner what you're working on in a way that they will find interesting and not boring. I loved going with my father to hear him give a lecture. I love doing that. And I'm really happy that my kids often come also. Ask me, they'll say to me, I want to come. And so I love that. And I always feel I give a better talk if my husband's sitting in the audience and smiling at me. And when my kids sit there and look so obviously bored reading a book or something, it's hard. But I did that too when I was little. I would go to my father's lecture and read a book. But it feels as though the whole family is doing something together. It's not, I'm not the one giving the lecture, it's the whole family. We're all together speaking. And my father made me feel that way too. And sometimes when he was aware that I was not feeling so happy that evening, he would, in the middle of his lecture, talk about me. And that was a way of signaling to me that I was on his mind even while he was lecturing.
Were there ever areas where you profoundly disagreed with him, or questioned his thinking?
You know, when I was young and we would go to visit my uncle, the Kapuzhnitzer Rebbe, for instance, and I would be frustrated that all the men were gathering with the Rebbe and sitting at the tish and listening and singing, and he would talk. And I was in the kitchen with the women. And my father said to me, "You're right, things will change." So that was great. He supported me. When I wanted a bat mitzvah, he supported me. I never argued with him about these things. Never. And it's kind of amazing because he came from such a different background.
Right.
And we were, you know, people use the expression strictly Orthodox. I don't like that expression. I would say lovingly Orthodox. I don't like strict, but okay. But yeah, we were clearly, I'm actually, even to this day, I'm learning that certain things that we did growing up, it's a minhag. It's not really halacha. It's, I didn't realize, but okay. Did I disagree? What did I disagree about? I think sometimes my father was very negative about the social sciences, and I understand why. I think maybe he gave up on them and they've changed. But I understand why he was giving up on them. I mean, sociologists were saying that secularism is taking over and religion is dead. My father thought that was awful. Well, they've now apologized, the sociologists of religion, Peter Berger and so on. My father thought psychoanalysis, he referred to it as Aleha Hashalom. As if it was already dead and it was female. So, you know, double.
Right. That's interesting.
Yeah, and I'm interested in psychoanalytic ideas. I think they're actually very helpful in understanding, first of all, literary texts clearly, but even in understanding historical movements. I find it intriguing, interesting.
I'm wondering if you'll talk a little bit about what it is to be a feminist, a Jewish feminist, and you know the opportunities for women have changed drastically and dramatically since your book, and so I'm curious from your perspective on that, on where that movement has been and where we are now.
Yes, well, I think it's very important for me to acknowledge that when I was growing up, I never thought things would change. My father said to me, yes, things will change. He said to me one day, why don't you become a rabbi? When I was saying, you know, what am I going to be when I grow up? And I said, oh, that'll never happen. He said, oh, I'm not so sure. I think things are changing. And I was amazed. And when Blue Greenberg said, one day there will be Orthodox women rabbis, I thought, no, but there are. There's the Maharat. Amazing. So that's also about the importance of hope and never to despair. My father used to say all the time, you know, despair is a sin, never despair. One must always have hope. And I think hope is very, very difficult. Maybe it's just difficult for me. I don't know. Maybe it's the era, the moment with this virus, a pandemic. But I think it's important for all of us to keep in mind that in fact things do change. And they've changed tremendously for women. I wish they changed as much for African Americans. I think it's still very hard, very, very hard, in ways that are much worse than they are for women. Racism is worse than sexism. It's not the same as anti-Semitism, it's different, but I think that nonetheless, Jews have the advantage, not all Jews, but a lot of Jews of white skin, so that there were, for example, Karen Brodkin points out that there were federal grants that were given after World War II that Jews could take advantage of to buy a home in the suburbs with a special financial grant. Whereas if you were African American, you were technically eligible for the grant, but the white suburb had these restrictions and you couldn't go in. And so that's important to keep in mind. So I'm glad for what we've accomplished as women, but as I said earlier, it's not enough to just be glad for what's good for my group. If everyone doesn't have the same security and the same, then no one does. So that's where I feel we must turn our attention right now. In terms of feminist issues, I just say the other day I heard Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez speak and talk about the unpleasantness of her encounter with Representative Yoho and some of the ugliness. And what that means. What does it mean to a woman to be spoken to in a denigrating way, to be dismissed like that, or to hear a vulgar term used? What does that do? What does it do not only to me as an individual woman? What does it do to our society? What does it say? What permission, as she pointed out, what permission does it give to people to say such things about his own wife and daughters? So these things have consequences. For me, the sexual harassment, the snide comments, the so-called flirtation in the workplace, etc., that comes out of this. It comes out of bad language. It comes out of dismissing women. It also comes out of not having women colleagues. It's not about just a wife and daughters and it, but colleagues. And I have worked with men, male colleagues, and I can tell that they never had a woman professor, a woman colleague, a woman senior to them. They don't know how to work with a woman. And it's very, very difficult for me to work with them. I've been with graduate students, men, who unwittingly, unconsciously adopt a patronizing tone of voice toward me, even though I'm a full professor. But that's because this is what they think, this is how they're modeling being a professional man. And that's what they've seen older, senior men, faculty, how they behave, and they do it too. That's not the way to behave. So these are very, okay. And then when I heard her say these words, Representative Ocasio-Cortez, I thought, I wonder why I haven't heard something like that, those same words, that kind of an analysis of sexism, very simple. Why I haven't heard that from the head of the ADL and the American Jewish Committee and the federations and the et cetera, all of these big organizations. And why is it that when somebody in a newspaper writing about, I don't know, Israeli politics, why do they call up for a statement, they call up AIPAC or they call up the AJC? Well, why don't they call Hadassah? Hadassah is a huge Zionist organization. Why isn't that the voice in the newspaper commenting? Why is it that even Jewish women's organizations, they're treated like women in the larger scheme of things? And I'm tired of it. And there's no reason why, if the ADL is capable of analyzing anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism and racism and Islamophobia, they are very good at analyzing and knowing how to think, and they have why don't they speak out on sexism? Why is, when I said once to one of these important men, and I was disturbed about some of the men who were now facing legal consequences for their sexual misbehavior and how awful I found that. And he said, I feel sorry for them. Now, a woman wouldn't say, I feel sorry for Harvey Weinstein and all of these guys, right? A woman wouldn't say that, but the women aren't in those positions. So, or things would be different. Anyway, okay. I'm sorry.
No, I appreciate that. I appreciate the candor, and I think it's it's a similar. I think about it when we have the type of vitriol coming from the highest office in our country, and the type of precedent that establishes for how we talk. You talk about language, the role of the importance of language. So I appreciated that piece. Were you surprised by some of the like, or how was that piece experienced? The piece that you wrote in the foreword around Representative Ocasio-Cortez's piece. How was that received?
In all kinds of ways. First of all, people started saying, well, there's this woman, she's an ally, she's a Jewish version. That isn't the point. We do, of course, have great women. There are rabbis who are extraordinary, women rabbis. Sharon Brous is a friend of mine, Rabbi Kleinbaum in New York. There's so many wonderful, Rabbi Rivera. They're wonderful women. And there's the NCJW and Hadassah and Vitso, great women's organizations. And there's a new woman who's been elected to be the head of the president of the Conference of American Jewish Organizations. But that wasn't really the point. The point is that I don't think that the understanding of sexism and how it affects women has really been taken in by Jews as something that affects Jews. I'm a Jew. Somebody came to Dartmouth to speak. Somebody said, affirmative action is terrible for the Jews. And I said, well, I'm a woman, and it's been great for me as a woman, and I'm a Jew. And he said, oh, I never thought of that. Well, why hadn't he thought of that? Maybe he's not talking to enough women and listening and understanding. But I feel this, they don't understand what sexism does to me, to my career, to my voice. And if they understood that also as a Jewish issue. Now, I feel that we're in a tremendous generation gap. When I say these things, The older generation thinks I'm radical crazy. They don't understand it. And the younger generation thinks, what are you talking about? We knew this 100 years ago. What are you, You're so backward. And we really are in this kind of era of gap. And we're going through a kind of cultural revolution right now. And the older generation doesn't realize, and the younger one, they don't know how to talk to each other. And I do feel somehow I'm neither one or the other.
There was a letter that you signed on recently that spoke a little bit about this the growing gap. Would you talk a little bit about that?
This was the Harper's letter.
The Harper's letter.
The Harper's letter made everybody upset. Okay, I don't know. The truth is, I read the letter and I thought, it wasn't really saying, I also thought it was a little out of touch. But people I know and respect asked me, okay, it wasn't saying anything that I thought was particularly offensive. And then everybody got upset. Why? So-and-so signed it. So-and-so, if they signed it, I shouldn't sign it. What do you mean? If they signed it, what? I'm this one, and anyway, I should be able to sit at the same table, even with people who say things that I can't say. I mean, I've been in Germany. I've worked on Nazis. I've been with people defending Nazis. After that, right. If I can do that, you can sit down and talk to, okay. Anyway, yes, there is this business. Somebody actually wrote something on Facebook and said, this is a professor, I will never cite or assign the work of anyone who signed this letter.
Wow.
And I wrote to her and said, well, would this mean that if one of the people, if somebody came up for tenure, you would vote against their tenure? And she didn't answer me, but I think that there is a loss of professionalism and professional culture, how we behave toward each other as professionals in our work as professionals. That I can, in fact, disagree with someone, but I have professional responsibilities, period. So that I found deeply, deeply worrisome, upsetting. And yeah, I'm a professional. I work with people who have very different views, but we have to speak to one another with respect. And I still want to even read the work of people with whom I disagree.
Right.
So that was, yeah.
I think, the value of machloket l'shem shamayim, disputes for the sake of heaven, or even engaging with people with a certain type of, kavod habriot, of just basic human decency and respect. And so,
well, yes. And in fact, for that matter, I mean, I think Jewishly, when it comes to kavod, we attain kavod for ourselves by showing kavod to other people. Mm-hmm. This is why, for example, it's so important to treat the body of someone who's died with great kavod. The person is dead and doesn't know it, doesn't know how he or she is being treated. Right. But our kavod comes from that, from showing. So kavod is actually something active, something we do. That's how I feel. Yeah. I just want to say, you come from a great family. You come from a family that has kept alive Yiddish culture in a way that's so incredibly important to us. Yiddish is not, as we know, not just a language. Yiddish is more than that. Yiddish is a whole culture and way of thinking and way of treating people. When I talk about kavod, I think about Yiddish.
Yeah. Derech Eretz.
Yes. And also in Yiddish culture, let's say you're upset with someone, instead of anger and cruelty, there's always an element of a little bit of humor, a little bit of don't get too upset.
That's right.
Yeah, that's so important.
Yeah.
I think it's important for us today. And I wonder sometimes if we were conducting ourselves in Yiddish instead of English, how different we would be in the way we treat each other.
I love that question. I mean, but part of that, what's at stake there is obviously a shared language, but shared values too that that are lost. I'm mindful of the time, and I want to ask you this next question, which is, given so much of what we've been talking about, whether it's in the academic sphere or the political storm that we find ourselves in, and you talked about the importance of never despairing, and yet it can be rather easy to look to scroll through Facebook and to despair. And so I'm curious for you, where your hope dwells and what you do to sort of nurture that in both your professional work and in your spiritual and your life as a Jew.
Well, I think first of all, it's a religious commandment that is, and as Hasidic Rebbe says, the story, someone comes to a Rebbe and says, "Where is the Kadosh Baruch Hu?" And you know what it says in the Psalm, that the earth is the Lord's. God is everywhere. And the Rebbe says, everywhere you let God in. So hope is also where you let it in. Mm-hmm. And despair is what keeps people from failing to understand that there is hope in the world. We put a kind of fence around ourselves. We don't let God in and we don't let hope in. And so I think the question then would be, and I'm reminded here of Nachman of Bratslev's commentary on Boel Paro, when God tells Moses to go to Pharaoh. And the commentary talks also about, Nachman was very concerned with Yoash, with despair. How do you help someone come out of despair? And so what does it take? And he says, sometimes you can't have an argument. You don't argue with someone about philosophical principles or science or something like that. It's different. It is, in a sense, he makes a distinction between the absence of God's presence and the presence of God's absence. Mm. And to live in despair is to live with the presence of God's absence. How do you lift someone out? How do you lift someone out of despair? He says, first of all, a tzaddik on the level of a Moshe Rabbeinu is the one who has to descend. And he talks about this famous Hasidic idea of Yerida, of descent. You descend, which means you have to feel how the other person is feeling. You have to know how they feel. And I think that's very important. You don't say to someone in despair, "Oh, well, things will get better," stiff upper lip. It's not so bad. After all, it could be worse. I mean, it's not a way to talk. Who talks like this? All right. So how do you feel what the other person is feeling? And I think that's such an important lesson for all of us, to be able to do that, to cultivate in ourselves the ability to feel with another person, to have that kind of empathy, which my father says is actually what he calls divine pathos, which says this is actually what the prophets are teaching, that God also feels with us. And to have the sense, the awareness that God feels with us, that God is affected by human beings, that we are an object of divine concern, that we're needed, and that there's a tzorach gavoha, that tzorach gavoha meaning that there is a divine need, that God needs us. And when we look at the words of Kaddish, for example, my father says, what is it telling us in Kaddish? May God's presence be magnified. So how do we do that? And that's the question, to magnify the presence of God. And that is not only about mitzvot. It's not only about keeping Shabbat and so on. It's also about, my father says, how you treat another human being. Mm-hmm. To understand another person. And that's really what the Hasidic Rebbe is all about. It's about understanding. It's about coming to a Rebbe who listens to you in such a deep way that you feel extraordinary. This person knows how I feel. Mm. And you know what that gives to you. That lifts you up. And that's what Nachman's talking about. To be able to listen to someone and give them that feeling that you do feel how they're feeling.
Mm.
That's what lifts someone out of the yoish, out of the despair. So I guess the question now would be also, despair keeps out hope. What can we do to maintain our hope? And remember also that hope isn't just a happy face. Hope is also about doing, about giving.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And that can be demonstrating in the street, but it also can be giving to another person one-to-one. It can be understanding another person, expressing oneself, writing something, even if it's a letter to a friend or an article in a newspaper. But that also brings hope.
Mm.
The hope that comes from the people who receive that and realize, I'm being understood. And that is such an uplift. And then you're acting like a Rebbe in a small way.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for your time and for your insight and for your vulnerability and honesty and in being here today together.
It's my pleasure. It's great to be with you always. Avram, I thank you. I thank you, and you are such a wonderful representative of your family and your family's heritage and what they have brought to all of us. And on behalf of all Jews and all people, I say to you, thank you.
Humbled. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Professor. Take good care.
You too. Be well.
Bye.
Bye.